in Charity Unfeigned. Chapter 1. Background to a Career. A decree issued by Pope Leo XIII on September 22 came into. This date, the territory now included within this ecclesiastical jurisdiction formed part of the Vicariate Apostolic of northern Minnesota. Properly speaking, therefore, the history of the Diocese of St. Cloud must be said to begin with the date of its canonical establishment by the Holy See. Yet the years immediately preceding this event are important years, and no historian writing the story of the Church in the Northwest can afford to ignore this period. The 37 years extending from 1852 to 1889 are of far-reaching significance, for they hold the key to an understanding of what transpired in later diocesan history. They are the formative years which witnessed the laying of the groundwork for the future growth and development of the diocese. The character of one man stands out almost throughout this entire period, and his personality dominates the scene. His words as much as his deeds had a profound influence on the course of events in the subsequent history of the Church in Minnesota. This man was Father Francis Xavier Pierz, who has been rightfully called the father of the Diocese of St. Cloud. When he arrived in Minnesota in the summer of 1852, he was already 67 years old and had labored for some 16 years among the Ottawa Indians of the Upper Michigan Peninsula. He was a Slovene, born in the Austrian province of Carniola, and therefore a subject of the Habsburgs who ruled the vast polyglot empire of Austria-Hungary. Like so many of their subjugated neighbors, the Slovenes were a national minor. Iti, who had been taken into protective custody by the House of Habsburg as far back as the Middle Ages. The entire subsequent history of this people is one of tragic and continual strife against tremendous odds to preserve their national identity and heritage from assimilation into the culture of their German overseers. Ruthless suppression of national aspirations, whether those of the Slovenes or of any other subject minority, was the order of the day. The conquerors worked strenuously to prevent union by exaggerating any differences the Yugoslavs might have among themselves, or even to create others in order to perpetuate their rule in this very strategic part of the Balkan Peninsula. These accidents of history that occur from time to time, placing one nation over another, very often succeed in influencing the very interpretation of history. Such has been the case with the Slovenes. They have played a remarkable role in the growth and expansion of the Catholic Church in America, yet little or no recognition has been given them by church historians. Or if it has in some isolated cases, they have been classified as Austrians or Germans rather than as Slovenes. To ascribe this to malicious intent on the part of particular historians would be unfair. It is perhaps more correct to say that it is the result of the too close identification of the Slovenes with Austria for so many centuries. The story of the Catholic missionary activity in the United States, which Europe carried on even from the days of Columbus, will not be complete until the contributions of the Slovene missionaries have been noted along with the others. When it has all been told, one of the brightest chapters in American Catholic history will have been written. The roots of our Catholic heritage are implanted deep in the soil of European civilization and culture, the struggling. Church in the New World was the recipient of the best that the Catholic peoples of Europe could afford to send across the sea. If, then, we point with pride to the present maturity and prosperity of the Church in America, we must never forget how much we owe to Europe. Without the men and money which, poured into America, we could never have hoped to see this day. No appeal from an American bishop or priest was ever ignored. It was always answered as fully as the circumstances of the time would permit. The discovery of America launched the Church upon one of her greatest missionary eras. It was a critical time in her history, for the New World was open to exploration and colonization on the eve of the Protestant Revolt. Luther's defiance of Catholic authority had set off the spark for the rebellion of a whole chain of reformers. But the Church met this crisis characteristically. She did not completely disavow the charges of her disobedient children. Reform was certainly necessary within the Church, and she sought to effect this through the agency of the Council of Trent. And while she grieved that so many millions of her faithful had become alienated from her, she turned her eyes westward to the New World. Here was a field rich for the harvest which would, in some measure, make up for the defections in Europe. The activities of the Spanish and French missionaries in the New World are already well known to every student of history. The heroic labors and achievements of the Spanish padres and French black robes among the American Aborigines occupy a prominent place in the history of our country. And this is only as it should be, for, as one writer remarks, the history of the United States, as well as the history of the Christian religions in the Western Hemisphere, opens with the story of Catholic missionary endeavor. Spanish Franciscans, later to be joined by Dominicans and Augustinians, were among the first to penetrate the unknown lands. Accompanying the conquistadors as chaplains, they lost no time in making known to the natives the knowledge of the one God and his worship. From the foothold which they secured in Mexico, other friars of a later generation, notably Junipero Serra, carried the cross northward into the region now embraced by the southwestern United States, and firmly implanted it there. These early missionaries brought the light of faith to benighted pagans, and with the faith, civilization, and culture, the unbiased mind must view with admiration the results achieved by these apostolic men working under the protection of the Spanish crown. They render false the charges so often made in the past that exploitation and enslavement of the natives was Spain's only interest in the New World. In his history of the Roman Catholic Church in the United States, O'Gorman points out that this one glorious truth stands prominent: the Spaniards in the United States did not drive the natives from their homes, or oppress them, much less destroy them. These accusations, if made at all, must fall on some other race. Even today, we can see the results of Spanish missionary activity in the United States. Our Southwest is dotted with enduring monuments which testify to the zeal and industry of the friars. It is no wonder that one historian has ventured to assert that no enterprise in the world's history was ever more vast in its ambitions, and none so vast was ever carried on against larger odds or with more intelligence, heroism, and energy. Equally determined, though unsuccessful to a lesser degree, were the missionary exploits of the black robes of New France. Here the Jesuits predominated, although there were some Franciscans and Augustinians also. The sons of Loyola were a familiar sight in the canoes of the couriers du Bois as they explored the vast wilderness region about the Great Lakes and along the stretches of the Mississippi and its tributaries. They were primarily missionaries, and their main purpose in accompanying the explorers and traders was to bring the gospel to the savages. However, they did not pass by any opportunity of collecting at the same time geographical and ethnological data which might be of help to their countrymen. This information was incorporated in their letters, along with reports on the progress of their work and the number of converts instructed, and baptized, and was sent to the superiors of the society in Europe, where it was eventually published under the title of Jesuit Relations. Two distinct missionary periods are perceptible in the history of the Church in America. The first was under the aegis of Spain and France. It continued steadily and on a broad front almost to the time of American national independence, but subsequently became sporadic and disorganized. A variety of circumstances had entered the picture which seriously curtailed missionary effort and in places wiped it out entirely. Thus, for example, the suppression of the Jesuits shortly before the American Revolution halted for a time their work in the United States. They came back after the turn of the century, this time to a new field among the Indians of the Northwest. It is outside the province of this work to detail the mission, laborers of the French and Spanish among the North American Indians. We can only indicate the success which those labors met. That it was considerable is amply borne out by the testimony of history. How much greater it might have been is a matter for speculation. Maynard comments thus, "One must reflect sadly upon the possibility, so nearly brought into actuality, that all the Indians of the North American continent might have been won for Christ. This is what would have happened had not the Protestant settlements undone the work of the Spanish and French missionaries. It is, however, useless to repine over the fate of the red man. He need not have been treated so badly, and yet it is difficult to see how he could have held his ground against an energy of which he had no conception. Nobody is now less American than the first inhabitant of this land, though he too might have found a place in American life had we been more wise and generous. As things turned out, he was swept away by a torrent too strong for him to withstand. From the time of the American War for Independence until our infant nation was well into its national period, missionary activity was at a very low ebb. All our resources and manpower were geared to the war effort. Communication with Europe for other than military assistance and financial aid was practically nil. Even after independence was won, little attention could be given to the evangelization of the Indians. The main work of the church in America was primarily to preserve an endangered faith, rather than to expel paganism or eradicate heresy. True, there were Indians in America, savage and exotic as any mission picture could offer, and the early missionaries who came in the wake of Columbus had aimed to save their souls and confer upon them the benefits of civilization, but the work of the early black robes was hindered and often destroyed by the material development of the 13 colonies. The 19th century, however, ushered in a second period of intense missionary activity. Desperate appeals from American bishops for financial assistance from the Catholic countries of Europe resulted in the establishment of 3 mission aid societies within the comparatively short period of 2 decades. The Society for the Propagation of the Faith, today functioning as a pontifical organization on a worldwide basis, began as a French national effort to assist the Foreign Mission Society of Paris, and in particular to help the struggling diocese of Bishop Dubourg in Louisiana. From the meeting between 2 priests and 10 laymen which took place in Lyons on May 3, 1822, emerged the simple plan later approved by the Holy See to collect funds for the missions. The Leopoldine Association, Austrian counterpart of the French Society, was founded on April 13, 1829. For the express and restricted purpose of aiding the Church in North America and limited in its membership to the Austrian realm. A third society was established at Munich in Bavaria on December 12, 1828. It was called the Ludwig Missionsverein in honor of King Louis of Bavaria, who had lent such a gracious ear to the appeal of Bishop Rizet of Detroit for the establishment of some organization to underwrite, partially at least, the costs of carrying on the work of the American Church. It is interesting to note that American prelates were behind the scenes in the formation of all 3 societies. In fact, they were instrumental in calling them into being. The good these organizations accomplished over the period in which they lent missionary assistance to the United States is incalculable. Without their steady backing, it seems highly unlikely that the Church could have made her actual remarkable progress in the 150 years of the country's national life. In many respects, the material assistance derived from Europe during the 19th century was among the least of the benefits received. This is not said with any intention of belittling the extent of the aid rendered. But the interest in the mission fields of America, which was aroused as a result of the flow of alms across the Atlantic, was important too, perhaps more important than the money, when a final accounting is made. And here again, it is the 3 societies themselves which rightfully may take the credit. All of them required that their beneficiaries report regularly to the central headquarters how the money was spent and how much progress was being made. In consequence, the correspondence exchanged between missionaries in America and officials in Europe was voluminous. Much of it was published in the official magazines of the societies. Priests and laypeople alike eagerly read these letters, and the result was a new understanding of the vastness of the American mission problem. The interest stirred up by the letters was not transitory. Imaginations were fired. Particularly were many priests of France, Austria, and Bavaria inspired to dedicate themselves to the work of the foreign missions. Advanced age, a comfortable parochial charge in their native land, the difficulties of adjustment to the hardships of missionary life, separation from home and loved ones. None of these reasons was strong enough to deter them from putting their resolve into execution once their minds were made up. Hence, the period from 1830 to about 1870 witnessed a great revival of missionary activity in the United States. The scene of labor, with some exceptions, remained very much the same, but the personnel had completely changed. Frenchman and Spaniard had been succeeded by German, Austrian, and Slovene. Almost a century separated the endeavors of the 2 groups. Only scattered tokens remained of the extensive earlier labors. In most areas, all tangible evidence that a priest had once visited them was missing. Yet in the hearts of the Indians, a Catholic tradition persisted and prepared the way for the missionaries of the 19th century. Pierz himself acknowledged the existence of this tradition. In one of his numerous letters to the headquarters of the Leopoldine Association in Vienna, he observed, "A Catholic missionary nowadays has nothing to fear for his life among the most barbarous tribes of this people, since they always show great respect to priests and call us with reverence the black gowns, on account of the old tradition of the pious French Jesuit fathers who have effected so much good among the Indians. Hence they accept only that religion which one brings to them in Jesuit cassock and with the French language, as the good Catholic faith, and call it the French faith." This is not the place to narrate the story of the German and Austrian missionaries who came to America in the period we are discussing, or to evaluate their work. Our subject here is a Slovenian priest. This is a study of his colorful career, which almost reached the century mark. Certain background material is included which is essential for a proper understanding of the man and his character. Francis Pierz was a product of his age, an age of political unrest and constantly changing national lines. There is no doubt about this. At times, it is the only explanation that can be given for some of the traits he evinced in his later life. At other times, it is the one factor which makes reasonable some course of action he chose to follow when everyone else adjudged it impractical. His character and personality in consequence stand out most clearly in the light of his own times. The history of his people, no less than the turbulent political era into which he was born, was responsible for the way in which that character and personality were molded and formed. This is especially manifest in his attitude toward the Indian policy in the United States. His love for the red man was an expression of the love he bore his own oppressed countrymen. It was the natural outcome of the misery and humiliation he knew and experienced as a boy, living under the rule of a foreign usurper whose only right to rule another people lay in the might of his power. Pierz had sensed this flagrant violation of justice almost from the day of his first conscious thought. He never forgot it. He met it again in America in the white man's treatment of the Indian. It aroused his fighting blood. There was plenty of that in him, thanks to the native temperament of his people, and he resisted, with an energy that defies description, any attempt to deprive the red man of his rights. In the end, he lost, as did all those who championed the cause of the Indian. Our treatment of the Indian contributes a dark page indeed to our national history. Perhaps the turn which events took in this matter was inevitable. It may be unfair to accuse the government in Washington of deliberately adopting a policy which was unfavorable to the Indians and could only spell their doom. Maynard analyzes the situation in these terms. What may be admitted is that the government itself wished to behave with decency, but was impelled to act as it did because of the constant friction that arose on the frontier. But what cannot be denied is that the friction was almost entirely due to the natural objection of the Indians to being defrauded of their lands by land companies and local administrations. Washington believed that no other course was open than that of protecting the whites when the Indians rose against them, even if the risings were, in almost every instance, created by white chicanery and aggression. Yet after making all due allowances for the difficulties the government had to deal with, the dishonor remains. The Indians were in the position of national wards and were in practice dealt with as though they were national enemies. After all, an administration as well as an individual is obligated to the keeping of a pledge, even when to do so is inconvenient. To say that the whites were a superior race and that as such they had a heaven-conferred right to sweep out of their path those whom they considered their inferiors is shamelessly Hitlerian. But that was the conviction of the whites, and upon it they acted with a persistent ruthlessness. The Indians simply had to get out of the way. They needed too much land for their hunting grounds. They refused to accept a new mode of life. They were thought of as lazy and dirty and treacherous. They had to be exterminated if they did not clear out. One could not reason with a frontiersman on this subject. His view was fixed, and he was determined that his view should prevail. One is compelled to smile with something akin to pity at the stock Anglo-Saxon charge that the Spanish policy in the New World officially endorsed by the Crown, was exploitation and enslavement of the natives. Nothing could be further from the truth. By contrast with the method actually pursued by the English and later by their American descendants, the Spanish procedure seems extraordinarily humane and benevolent. Whatever cruelties and excesses were perpetrated by Spaniards were due to individual wrongdoing. They were always contrary to the official attitude, and when the government got wind of any such misdeeds, the guilty were called to strict account. In his monumental History of the Popes, Pastor writes as follows: "Although the Spanish conquerors and their immediate successors cannot escape the blame of harshness and cruelty toward the natives, it would nevertheless be unjust to make the Spanish government responsible for their excesses, or to speak of the abuses of those early days as typical of the whole Spanish administration of the colonies. On the contrary, no European nation has shown on the whole greater care and anxiety for the welfare of the native populations than the Spaniards. Whereas under English rule the Indians of North America were left in their savagery, and attempts were even made to drive them out and destroy them, in the Spanish possessions in America the principle had been accepted, even in the time of Isabella of Castile, of treating the Indians as free subjects, enjoying the same rights as Europeans. The middle 19th century witnessed an unusual phenomenon in the American mission scene. Representatives of one of the smallest national groups in the world shouldered the burden laid down by the French Jesuits over a century before, the evangelizing of the Great Lakes region. These were the Slovene missionaries. They entered the field in 1831. By 1848, they had completely staffed the missions on the northern shore of Lake Michigan and on the shores of Lake Superior. The region which they took under their spiritual care was a vast one, and for the most part inhabited by Indians and half-breeds. Here and there only might one encounter a white settler, or trapper. There were not nearly enough recruits to care for the whole territory adequately, but this did not discourage them. They situated themselves in places which would permit them to cover as wide a field as possible, by canoe and on foot, by horse and on snowshoes. They traversed thousands of miles each year as a matter of routine, and thought nothing of it. The story of how the territory came into their hands is an interesting one. Certainly this happened more by default than by design. Baraga was the forerunner. A pamphlet by the Vicar General of the Diocese of Cincinnati describing the lack of priests in America and the pitiful condition of the church there induced him to volunteer for this new field of labor, regretfully his. Bishop the Ordinary of Laibach gave him permission to undertake the work provided he found an American bishop who would receive him into his diocese. Baraga was not personally acquainted with any American bishop, but since it was the Vicar General of Cincinnati who was responsible for his decision to become a missionary, he decided to write to the ordinary of that diocese. The bishop's reply reached him on September 22, 1830. Needless to say, he was accepted and was urged to come as soon as the settlement of his affairs permitted. Baraga took leave of his homeland the following month. He went to Vienna to beg the assistance of the newly formed Leopoldine Association for his passage across the Atlantic. 67 days later, he presented himself to Bishop Edward Fenwick of Cincinnati. Although he was eager to begin work among the Indians immediately, he deferred to the bishop's wish that he remain in Cincinnati until the spring thaw in order to familiarize himself with the English language and American customs. On May 28, 1831, in company with Bishop Fenwick, he arrived at Arbre Croche. This former outpost of the Jesuit missions had been revived only 2 years previously. Father Peter de Jean, a French secular priest, had been in charge until his return to his native land a short while before. Baraga was his successor, and from that day until his death in 1868, he carried on a tireless apostolate among the Red Men. His fervent appeals for more volunteers from among the priests of his native Slovenia found their first response in the person of Francis Xavier Pierz. Arriving in Detroit on September 18, 1835, Father Pierz was immediately assigned as assistant to Baraga. These two zealous priests were but the vanguard. A number of others followed. In the historical study already cited, Austrian aid to American Catholics Benjamin Blyde indicates that 15 Slovenian priests from the Diocese of Laibach II were working in America in 1869. By 1882, the number had increased to 19. Moreover, among priests listed as coming from dioceses which were properly speaking German, there were undoubtedly some of Slovene origin also. But even the known figure is impressive. Doubly so if one considers that the Slovenes in the entire world total only some 2 million people. It would be impossible to give more than a bare enumeration of the names of the more outstanding of these missionaries. Many of them deserve a biography in their own right, for their labors were richly rewarded by tangible and lasting results. 5 of them were elevated to the episcopacy, and were ordinaries of American sees at a time when most dioceses were still in their formative years. This is in itself a tribute to the character of these men, for the system of screening employed by the Holy See in order to obtain candidates for the purple permits none but men of exceptional virtue and talent to pass. The Franciscan Otto Scola came in 1841. At first he was assigned to the German parish in Detroit, but his persistent pleas for work among the Indians induced his bishop to send him to La Pointe in 1843. Succeeding Baraga there, he began an apostolate among the Great Lakes Indians that lasted for 14 years. Finally, in 1857, he was compelled to retire B. Cause of a chain of vicious rumors assailing his character, which were circulated by his enemies among the pagan Indians. This almost broke Father Scola's heart, but he submitted to the inevitable, realizing that in the face of these slanders, he could no longer do effective work. Ignatius Marac, who succeeded Baraga as the second bishop of the Diocese of Sault-Ste. Marie and Marquette entered the field in 1845 as an assistant to Father Pierz, then in charge of Arbre-Croche. Upon his arrival, Pierz divided his huge mission and entrusted a sizable portion of it to the newcomer, with headquarters at La Croix. Marac remained here until 1869, when he was elevated to the episcopacy. Even then he left with reluctance. At heart, he was always a missionary, and only obedience moved him to accept the new dignity and proceed to Cincinnati for his consecration. He ruled the Diocese of Marquette for approximately a decade, resigning on account of sciatic rheumatism. Upon his retirement, he returned to work among his beloved Indians. He died in 1901. Lawrence Ladishar's career in the American missions was tragically short-lived. He came to this country in 1854 and worked for 4 years among the Indians of the Upper Michigan Peninsula. In 1858, he joined Father Pierce, who had been transferred to the new ecclesiastical jurisdiction of St. Paul. Only a few months later, his friends and relatives in Austria were shocked to read of his death. His story is recounted in a later chapter. Many other names could be added to this list. There was, for instance, John Siebel, who came in 1859. He was a man of varied and extraordinary talents. As a linguist, he had no equal among the priests with whom he labored, and this is saying a great deal. Baraga, Pierce, Scola, and the others all knew fluently 3 or 4 languages at the very least. Sebel, however, spoke English, French, German, several Indian dialects, 5 Slavic languages, Arabic, and the 2 classical languages, Latin and Greek. Northern Wisconsin was the scene of his apostolate. He built the church in Bayfield, Wisconsin, and established as well what eventually became the cathedral parish in the Diocese of Duluth. In 1872, he left America and went to India to do missionary work there. A few more years found him working as a parish priest in the Diocese of Versailles. In 1882, he returned to Michigan to resume the labors he had given up so many years before. The Slovenes supplied these missionaries to the church in America during the period which was without doubt the golden age of her missionary endeavor. It should be noted that America was not the sole recipient of this stream of priests. Asia and Africa too, but particularly the latter, received their share. Ignatius Klobahar, who was Vicar Apostolic of Central Africa, stands out in mission annals as the prototype of the Slovene missioner. His was an unusually attractive personality, and he was chiefly responsible for stimulating the spirit of intense mission-mindedness which prevailed among his countrymen during the 19th century. Many a parish priest in Carniola made his decision to volunteer for the foreign missions only after reading one of Klobuchar's enthusiastically written accounts of his experiences on the Dark Continent. There is something phenomenal in the fact that the majority of the priests who decided to become missionaries were of mature years. These men were not novices in the ministry, but tried veterans in charge of comfortable benefices. Yet they willingly gave up their hard-earned security and steeled themselves to a new life radically different from that which they formerly enjoyed. What is more, they received encouragement meant from their bishops to go through with their design, which is surprising in view of the fact that the dioceses stood to lose some of their best men. In most cases, priests were even permitted a temporary leave of absence, so that, in the event any of them decided to turn back, he found his parish awaiting him. To their credit, it must be said that few of them did turn back. What was the character of this man, the Slovenian missionary? By far the best analysis is given by Tenley. Speaking of the work of Baraga, Pierz and the others, he observes, "These missionaries were thorough workers and they were realists. They acquired a mastery of the native language. They knew the Indian as an Indian and as a human being. Being Slovenes, their vision of objectives and means was not clouded by prepossessions in favor of American or French forms of civilization. They were not tempted to Americanize or Frenchify the Indian. Their objective was to impress upon him the Christian spirit and character, and to stimulate him to develop a satisfactory domestic, social, and economic life out of the rudiments of civilization that he already possessed. They were convinced of the power of the Catholic system to transform and elevate the adult as well as the more plastic child. They brought its wholesome influence to bear upon every member of the group. An intense religious life, constant instruction and oversight of old and young, and practical education in the ways of better living were the chief means that they used. Their financial resources were pitifully small, but this was compensated for by deep devotedness. The large number of their converts is far less impressive than the earnestness of the new Christians. Their perseverance, their sobriety, their industry, and their adoption of a settled life, their material improvement was slow, but it was genuine. Results varied too, for the out missions received less attention than the central missions, and the influence of the missionary was there less profound.